Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be seen not as a person, but as a wallet with a pulse? What happens when the quiet one, the daughter everyone forgets, is the same person silently holding the entire family afloat? My name is Naomi, and for most of my life, I was invisible. Not because I had nothing to say, but because no one ever thought to ask. I grew up in a family where love had conditions and worth was measured by usefulness. For years, I was the girl who didn't complain, who didn't take up space, who didn't need attention, and they loved me for that, until they realized I was more than just their background character. On one unforgettable Thanksgiving afternoon, my younger sister held up my open laptop to a room full of relatives. Her voice was casual, even amused. But the numbers on the screen told a different story. My story. My hidden company. My 7-figure portfolio. My life they never cared to ask about. In that moment, everything cracked. They didn't ask how I did it. They asked why I kept it. From them. And the answer to that question is everything they never wanted to hear. Let me tell you what silence really sounds like. Let me take you back. Before the confrontation, before the judgment, before the silence turned into armor. I grew up in a coastal town in Oregon, the kind of place where the fog rolls in like a soft secret, and neighbors wave out of habit, not warmth. My parents were, on the surface, decent people. My father taught environmental science at the local community college. He loved graphs, tide charts, and cleaning his hiking boots with a toothbrush. My mother owned a modest wellness shop, Her. Pride was a display of hand-labeled tinctures and herbal teas she claimed could cure anything from heartbreak to eczema. We weren't wealthy, but the bills were paid, and I never went to bed hungry. From the outside, it all looked intact. I was their only child for the first 6 years, and during that time, I remember fragments of real warmth. My mom once told me, I had the kind of mind that noticed things other kids didn't. I believed her. I noticed the way the sunlight hit the edges of her shop window just before closing. I noticed how my dad's face changed when he was about to correct someone. Even gently, I was the kind of child who listened, who read quietly, who never interrupted adult conversations. People said I was easy. And that word would cling to me longer than I realized. Back then, the world was small and predictable. Saturdays meant walks to the farmer's market where I was allowed to choose one pastry and one book from the used cart. At home, I made watercolor paintings no one hung up, but everyone politely glanced at. I didn't mind, not yet. My bedroom window faced a pine tree that made creaking sounds in the wind, and I'd imagine it whispering stories just for me. I was content being the background character in my own life, as long as there was peace. That peace ended when my sister Celeste was born. Her arrival was dramatic, early, complicated, and wrapped in medical urgency. I remember waking up to the sound of the landline ringing at dawn, the kind of sound that feels heavier than it should. Dad drove off without saying goodbye, and Mom didn't come home for 3 days. When they returned, they brought a tiny infant, wrapped in layers of softness and instructions. Celeste had severe respiratory issues and a rare autoimmune condition. From that moment, everything in the house was rerouted through her needs. The thermostat was adjusted to her sensitivity. Every room smelled faintly of antiseptic. I was told not to bring my school bag inside until it had been aired out. My cough became a reason to stay elsewhere. My voice became too loud. My presence became an inconvenience. At first, I tried to understand. I was old enough to sense that something fragile had entered our lives, and I wanted to protect her too. But over time, protection became exclusion. I wasn't allowed to hold her, then not to touch her, and eventually, not to be around her for too long. Naomi's always been so mature, my mother would say, patting my head without looking at me. She knows her sister's health comes first. And just like that, I became the quiet one, the reasonable one, the reliable one. Celeste was sweet, but loud in the way children who are constantly praised often are. She cried and was coddled. She sang and was filmed. Her drawings were taped to the fridge. Mine were folded neatly and slid into drawers. I wasn't jealous of her. Not at first. I was more confused by the shift in gravity. Our home had become a planet I no longer orbited. I was in the same rooms, breathing the same air, yet somehow never fully present. I disappeared not because I changed, but because the rules changed around me. The oddest part was that no one noticed. Not really. My parents assumed my silence was self-sufficiency, that my solitude was comfort. They told their friends how proud they were of my independence, how I never asked for anything, how I understood the pressure they were under. But I didn't. I only understood that love, once generously given, had been reassigned. There's a specific kind of grief in being replaced without malice. I wasn't cast aside violently. I was slowly rewritten in their narrative as someone who didn't need affection, so I started writing my own story. Not with pen and paper at first, but with small, defiant choices. I saved gift money instead of spending it. I spent hours at the library reading books about forgotten painters, abandoned architecture, lost objects. I started noticing beauty in the overlooked. A rusted brooch, an unframed painting at a yard sale. I began collecting them, not the objects themselves, but the histories buried inside them. While Celeste's world was full of attention, mine became a quiet archive of potential. Looking back, I realize I was building something even then, something stronger than love. A reason to matter, a reason to wake up, a reason to someday be more than a footnote in my own family's story. I didn't know yet what form it would take, but I knew I would not always be unseen, and so, the girl who was easy, the one who didn't ask for much, who always understood, she started watching, remembering, preparing, not for revenge, not for validation, but for freedom. Celeste didn't just arrive, she eclipsed. After her birth, it was as if our family dynamic rotated entirely around this new, fragile sun. At first, it was subtle. Adjustments to the lighting, to the air quality, to the food we ate. Then came the protocols. Shoes off at the door, no perfumes, no loud music. Visitors had to be cleared. Even hugs were monitored for their potential to carry illness. Everything revolved around what Celeste needed, and as those needs expanded, my place shrank. They called it love, protection, duty. I called it quiet exile. By the time Celeste was in kindergarten, my parents were no longer just attentive. They were obsessive. She had weekly appointments with a specialist in Portland, a homeopathic therapist, and a custom dietary plan that involved ingredients I wasn't allowed to touch. Our modest house turned into a curated environment for her comfort. My mother decorated her room in soft neutrals, fairy lights, and essential oil diffusers, while mine remained the same, functional, untouched, practical. That contrast felt louder than any argument. Celeste began to develop a kind of magnetic charm. She had that rare gift of appearing effortlessly special. Teachers loved her, despite her average grades. Neighbors adored her. My mother would say things like, "She just brings joy into a room, don't you think?" I didn't disagree. Celeste was lovely, but I couldn't help but notice that the more she shined, the more I had to dim myself to keep the peace. What made it worse was how gently I was being erased. No one yelled at me. There were no punishments, no harsh words, just a constant stream of redirected attention. I could get straight A's, win the district writing contest, be chosen to speak at the state science fair, and it would be acknowledged with a glance, maybe a nod. But if Celeste painted a butterfly on cardboard, it was framed and celebrated like a masterpiece. She's finally expressing herself. my father would say with wonder. I began to test the boundaries. Subtly. I'd stay out late after art club to see if anyone noticed. I'd skip dinner to read in the attic. I once purposely left a fake note in my backpack saying I was thinking of running away. My mother found it while checking for missing permission slips. She placed it back without saying a word. Not a question. Not a comment. Just nothing. So I stopped waiting for recognition. And that was when I started watching them differently. Not as parents to impress, but as people trapped in their own illusions. I saw my father's growing detachment, how he buried himself in research articles no one asked for. I saw my mother's anxious grip on control, as if she could manage everyone's emotions by controlling her environment. And I saw Celeste being raised to believe the world would always bend to her comfort. We grew apart quietly. She started middle school around the time I entered high school. By then, I'd developed a reputation for being self-sufficient and focused. Teachers praised me for being low maintenance. No one asked if I was lonely. Celeste, on the other hand, had an entourage. She joined a performance choir. My parents bought her a secondhand violin that sat untouched on a custom-built stand, while I was still borrowing library laptops to finish my portfolio submissions. I don't blame her, not really. Celeste didn't choose to be adored. She didn't notice that every time she asked for something, I gave up something in return. She didn't see that her emotional needs emptied our family's reserves, leaving none for me. She just absorbed the love that was offered. And I trained myself to expect none. Then came the moment that made everything clear. It was the week before my high school graduation. I'd just received a full scholarship to a university on the East Coast, majoring in art restoration. I printed out the acceptance letter and placed it gently on the kitchen table with a little yellow sticky note that said, "I did it." When I returned that evening, it was gone. I thought maybe someone had pinned it to the fridge. Instead, I found it tucked into the mail sorter next to expired coupons. No one said a word. That same evening, my family was in the living room, watching Celeste perform in a live-streamed school recital. She was third in line, off-key, smiling wide. They clapped even through the screen. "She has such stage presence," my mom whispered with tears in her eyes, and I remember thinking, I could win a Pulitzer, and they'd still ask if Celeste needed a ride to pottery class. So I made a decision that night. Not out of spite, not even from anger, but from clarity. I would no longer chase what they would never give. I would no longer wait to be chosen in a home that had already decided who mattered most. If they couldn't see me now, I'd build a life so luminous, so undeniable, that someday they'd be forced to ask how I ever disappeared from view, and I wouldn't answer. Not right away. After graduation, I didn't throw a party. I didn't expect a cake, or a card, or even a seat at the dinner table that wasn't already claimed by Celeste's friends during her end-of-year pool party. I simply packed my bags, folded the scholarship, let her into a worn notebook, and took a one-way bus to the East Coast. No send-off, no promises to visit. Just a quiet exit from a stage I was never meant to stand on. College was the first place where silence wasn't seen as absence. In seminar rooms and studio classes, quiet meant focus. Observing meant understanding. I devoured books on art history and the science of preservation. I worked late nights cataloging damaged frescoes and learned to steady my hand under harsh, white lamps. It was the first time in my life that someone asked what I thought and waited for the answer. Still, I couldn't shake the instinct to hide my progress. Every win felt too fragile to share. I was awarded a fellowship in my second year and used the stipend to buy archival tools instead of celebration. I was invited to speak at a graduate symposium, and I declined, not out of humility, but fear that, if I stood too tall, someone from home might notice and try to pull me back. Instead, I channeled everything into mastery. I became obsessed with forgotten artists, anonymous pieces buried in estate sales, unsigned canvases with stories embedded in each brushstroke. I wrote essays late into the night, sketching the connections between craftsmanship and worth, between what was dismissed and what simply hadn't been recognized yet. In those hours, I wasn't just restoring art, I was restoring myself. I developed a knack for identifying value where others overlooked it, not just financially, but culturally, emotionally. A tarnished ring with an unusual hallmark, a faded tapestry with an unusual stitch. My professors called it instinct. I called it survival. The same skill that helped me read my mother's shifting moods and my father's retreat into silence was now my sharpest asset. By junior year, I began accepting quiet freelance work, authenticating heirlooms, consulting for local galleries. I'd show up with a magnifier, a set of gloves, and no last name. Clients respected my precision, my discretion. They didn't need a backstory. They just needed someone who could see what others missed. Back home, Celeste had started her first semester at a private liberal arts college. She posted constantly, photos of her dorm, matcha lattes, and new shoes tagged with vague captions like "Grind never stops" and "Manifesting greatness." My mother liked every post. My father commented heart emojis. I watched from a distance, not because I missed them, but because part of me still wanted to understand what it felt like to be noticed without earning it. At the end of that year, I made one mistake. I sent my parents a brief email. I told them I was doing well, that I had just co-authored a research paper with a leading art conservationist, that I'd been offered a summer residency in Florence, fully funded. The reply came 3 days later. 2 lines. "Proud of you, Naomi. Do you know if Celeste's insurance covers naturopathy sessions? She's been under a lot of pressure lately." That was the last time I reached out. I didn't need proof that their priorities hadn't changed. But that moment clarified something I hadn't fully accepted until then. I was no longer their daughter in any meaningful way. I was an ATM with a personality, a shadow who didn't cast one back. And if they only saw me as a resource, then I would control exactly how, and if, I showed up in their lives. So I buried myself deeper in the work. I expanded my skills into high-value appraisal, jewelry authentication, provenance tracking. I took late trains to old towns, sat with widows, in sunlit kitchens cataloging their forgotten treasures. I learned to spot microscopic flaws in diamonds, forged signatures on gallery labels, and invented methods to identify early 20th century alloys by scent and texture alone. I was becoming something rare, an expert who didn't need to prove herself because her work spoke louder than any introduction. But still, I kept my success quiet. I told no one how much I was making. I wore secondhand coats. I used a cracked phone screen. It wasn't humility, it was protection. Because I knew, the moment my family discovered who I had become, they wouldn't ask what it cost me to get there. They would ask what I could give. It wasn't until the summer before my final year of college that I met someone who truly saw me, not the achievements, not the discipline, but the person underneath. Her name was Ramona Torres. She ran a small, time-worn bookstore tucked between a locksmith and a vegan donut shop in Providence. I wandered in one afternoon while waiting for a repair on my laptop, lured by a dusty first edition in the window. Inside, the air smelled like paper and rosewood. The shelves were uneven, the lighting soft and golden. Ramona looked up from behind the counter, where she was cataloging a stack of auction catalogs, and simply asked, "Looking for anything rare or just hiding from something common?" I stayed for 2 hours that day. Ramona was in her 60s, sharp-eyed and unapologetically observant. She'd worked in private antiquities for years before retiring to run her bookstore, which she jokingly called a cover for her treasure hunting habit. We began talking about provenance, artifact tracing, obscure publishing houses. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, but it was her intuition that floored me. She could look at a crumbling spine or a forgotten brooch and say, "This one has a story. It just hasn't been told properly." She started inviting me in on weekends to help sort new acquisitions. Some were junk, some were gold. She taught me how to look past the dust, how to find the maker's mark hidden under corrosion, how to tell if a gemstone had been reset by an amateur. One afternoon, she handed me a cracked velvet jewelry box and said, "Don't trust the polish, trust the craftsmanship." Inside was a filigree pendant that turned out to be an early Tiffany prototype. I never forgot how it felt to recognize what others missed, and to be recognized in the process. Over time, Ramona became something I hadn't realized I was missing. A witness. Not a mentor who assigned tasks or a supervisor who judged results, but someone who saw the whole of me. She never once asked about my family, but I think she knew. She understood the particular exhaustion of being exceptional in silence. One night, while we were labeling estate pieces for a private client, she paused and said, "You're the kind of person people only notice when they need something. That makes you powerful, but it also makes you vulnerable. Be careful who you let define your value." It landed like truth, because it was. That summer, under her guidance, I took my first real leap. I registered a sole proprietorship under a quiet name, Heiress North, an alias built from fragments of mythology and personal reinvention. I started taking private verification requests, mostly from family-owned jewelers and vintage shops. I charged less than the big firms, but offered something they couldn't: obsessive accuracy and complete discretion. I didn't advertise. Clients found me through whispers and referrals. And slowly, I built a reputation. I rented a small studio above a florist's warehouse, a drafty space with terrible insulation but perfect north-facing light. I furnished it with repurposed shelves, a desk made of old doors, and a single locked cabinet where I kept my most delicate tools. I kept everything minimal, quiet. On purpose. At night, I'd return to my student apartment and track every dollar, in a hand-bound ledger. I still ate rice and lentils, still walked instead of taking the train. My classmates went to rooftop parties. I went to estate auctions. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was trying to create something that couldn't be erased by someone else's comfort. I worked harder than I needed to. I double-checked my work until my eyes ached, but each time I correctly identified a forged stamp or reclaimed a piece miscategorized as junk, it felt like a small justice, a tiny rebellion against the world that once told me I was forgettable. Now I was making a life out of not forgetting. Ramona saw all of it. She never told me I was special. She told me I was relentless. She once handed me a note in an old book that read, "Quiet power is the most difficult to steal." That note is still framed in my office today. That summer changed me. Not because I found success, but because I found proof that being overlooked wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my edge. I didn't need an audience. I needed clarity. And with Ramona, with those rare stones and broken books, I found it. By the time I graduated, the alias Heiress North had become more than just a signature on invoices. It was a fully formed identity, a name whispered in niche antique circles, especially among those who couldn't afford the glitzed-up authentication services that catered only to elite collectors. I didn't need marble offices or a marketing team. All I needed was my expertise, a sharp eye, and the discipline to do what others overlooked. I declined the job offers my professors passed along. One museum wanted me to join their provenance team for an entry-level position that barely covered rent. Another firm offered a salaried role where I'd spend my days verifying other people's opinions. None of it appealed to me. I wasn't interested in serving legacy institutions that had never made room for voices like mine, quiet, precise, and fiercely independent. So I went solo. I moved into a cramped apartment on the edge of a historic district in Philadelphia. It had creaky floors, a slanted kitchen, and windows that whistled when the wind was strong. But it came with a bonus: a dusty back room that I converted into my private workspace. I built a secondhand drafting table from reclaimed wood. I installed new locks on the doors. Every tool I used, calipers, UV lights, gemstone scopes, fiber optics, was cataloged and insured. Every item I handled was photographed, logged, and archived. I ran the place like a lab because for me, it wasn't just business. It was proof of life. Clients came slowly at first. A pawnshop owner who'd been burned by a bad deal. A newlywed whose grandmother's wedding set was dismissed as costume jewelry, until I traced its origin to a Depression-era designer whose pieces now commanded 5 figures at auction. Word spread, not quickly, but deeply. People remembered me not because I advertised, but because I told the truth when no one else had the patience to find it. Still, I kept it all hidden from my family. To them, I was just trying things out. I let them believe I was struggling, drifting through odd jobs and side gigs. Occasionally, my mother would send a concerned message about job security or health insurance. My father once emailed me a listing for a receptionist position at a local dental clinic, just in case I wanted something stable. I responded with a polite thanks and said nothing more. What they didn't know was that I had landed a private contract with a regional museum to authenticate an estate donation. A 19th-century jewelry collection tucked away in a dusty attic by a family who thought it worthless. What they didn't see was the moment I opened a small gold locket engraved with a nearly invisible artisan's mark and realized it had belonged to one of the first female jewelers recognized by the Parisian Guild. That single discovery appraised at $75,000. I watched the curator's eyes widen, then mist, as if I had resurrected a lineage that had been waiting for someone to care enough to name it. Moments like that weren't rare. They were just quiet. They happened in hushed offices, over soft gloves and coffee-stained notebooks. No applause, no spotlight. Just someone finally seeing the truth behind what the world had mislabeled. In those moments, I saw myself. Meanwhile, back home, Celeste had changed her major for the 3rd time, now studying visual merchandising at a private college that specialized in creative commerce. Tuition wasn't cheap, and somehow, miraculously, it was always covered. My parents never said where the money came from. They just let it flow, monthly, steadily, unquestioned. I had started sending them transfers under a vague label: family support. It began with a small amount, enough to help, not enough to be noticed. But when they mentioned an unexpected medical bill, I increased it. When Celeste needed funds for a study abroad semester, I added more. I told myself it was my way of giving. Back of not being the bitter one, of staying human. But part of me knew better. They never once asked where the money came from. Never wondered how a daughter they assumed was barely getting by could afford thousands in monthly deposits. It was easier for them not to know, easier to pretend that someone else, a distant uncle, a government grant, was footing the bill. My name was on the bank transfer. They just chose not to say it out loud, and I let them, because I wasn't. Ready for what would come next, the questions, the expectations, the entitlement. Instead, I kept working. I took on more contracts, hired a part-time assistant, launched a minimalist website under Eris North that displayed nothing but a contact form and the phrase discretion, precision, provenance. My business grew like roots, deep, quiet, unshakable. I authenticated pieces for private collectors, for indie designers reclaiming historical techniques, for estate lawyers managing generational wealth no one knew existed. I sat across from people who didn't expect me to have answers, until I gave them the ones they didn't even know they were looking for. I lived simply. I wore the same coat for 3 winters. I walked past luxury stores without hesitation. Not because I couldn't afford anything, but because I had finally created a life I didn't need to decorate to feel valuable. And all the while, I knew the silence wouldn't last forever. Someday, the truth would surface. And when it did, I'd be ready, not just to defend what I'd built, but to remind everyone who had underestimated me exactly what they chose to ignore. The shift didn't come with a crash. It came like rust, slow, quiet, creeping over everything. From the outside, nothing about my life screamed success. I still lived modestly, still used the same cracked phone screen, still declined every holiday invitation from my family with vague excuses about deadlines and a client from Europe. But behind those ordinary details was a company that had quietly expanded into 3 cities, handled authentication for auction houses on both coasts, and was now consulting on a multi-million-dollar restitution case involving stolen wartime jewelry. And yet not once did my family ask what I was doing, really doing. Instead, they stayed comfortably inside the fiction they had written for me. Naomi, the stubborn one. Naomi, the artsy loner. Naomi, who probably lived off odd grants and scraped by on instant ramen. They told that story often enough that even they believed it. And I let them, because the truth felt too heavy to offer to people who never valued what I had to say when I had nothing. Then came the car. Celeste had just completed her 4th major, this time lifestyle branding and user experience design, whatever that meant. A week later, she posted a photo online with a caption that read, "Work hard, treat yourself harder." The photo showed her leaning against a matte black BMW, limited edition, custom interior, fresh from the showroom. A car that cost more than I had paid for my entire Philadelphia apartment in 3 years. The comments were full of admiration. "You're killing it, girl." Boss energy. Manifested success. But I recognized the model instantly. And I also recognized the numbers in my own business ledger, where $9,000 had been quietly transferred the month before, marked as family support, emergency tuition gap. I didn't react. I didn't text. I didn't even screenshot it. I just sat there in my studio, staring at the monitor, letting the quiet churn in me. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for explanation because it's already passed through the stage of disbelief. It wasn't just the car. It was the performance of independence. The ease with which my success had been consumed to fund someone else's image of achievement, while I was still being discussed like a financial burden or, at best, a mystery. Then, the comments from my parents started to shift subtly at first. My mom left a voicemail saying Celeste was finally finding her rhythm, and that all that financial help paid off. My father forwarded me an article about the importance of siblings supporting each other emotionally and economically, with a little note at the top. Thought this might interest you, and yet still, no one asked how I was affording any of it. No one asked if I was okay, if I needed support, if I was thriving or surviving. It was easier to believe in the myth of Naomi the helper than face the reality that I had outgrown their narrative entirely. But the real fracture came. A month later, when Celeste's boyfriend, Evan, accidentally outed the truth. It happened at a family gathering I didn't attend, as usual. Evan, unaware of the unspoken family fiction, casually mentioned that he'd come across an article with my company's name listed in the credits of a high-profile Sotheby's auction. He'd looked it up out of curiosity and found a niche forum where collectors were discussing my authentication work with the kind of reverence usually reserved for industry legends. He thought it was cool. My family apparently thought it was a joke. My mother called me that evening in a strange tone, half curious, half suspicious. "So, this heiress person, that's not you, is it?" I remember pausing, letting the silence thicken, then answering, "It is." The silence that followed was unlike any before. Not the silence of distance, the silence of disruption. From that moment, the air changed. Suddenly, they wanted to know more. But not in the way someone asks out of genuine interest. It was in the way someone peeks over your shoulder at your bank screen, polite but pointed. My mother asked if I'd consider helping Celeste expand her personal brand. My father suggested I invest in a family property to create shared security. Celeste texted me a meme about rich sisters who forget where they come from, followed by LOL unless. It wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. I had spent years giving quietly. They had spent years receiving without thanks. And now, the moment they caught a glimpse of the truth, they acted like I owed them a deeper explanation. Or worse, a larger portion. But what they didn't know, what they would soon learn, is that I had been preparing for this moment since the day I left home. And this time, I wasn't coming back to prove anything. I was coming back to end it. The invitation came wrapped in guilt. My mother called 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, her voice unusually soft, like she was trying to ease into something she already knew I wouldn't want. She said no one was really up for cooking this year. Said it would mean a lot if I came home, just for the weekend. Said the family missed me. It wasn't the words that convinced me. It was the pause after them. A hesitation that felt rehearsed. A hint that they weren't just asking me to attend, they were expecting something. I agreed, not out of obligation, but calculation. I needed to see them. Not for closure, not for reconciliation, but to confirm something I had suspected for a long time. They hadn't changed. They'd just been waiting. I arrived the morning of Thanksgiving, earlier than expected. The house hadn't changed much. Still beige walls and dusty family photos. Still Celeste's school trophies lining the hallway shelf like a shrine to moderate success. I brought dessert, a selection of delicate tarts from a high-end patisserie in Boston. I watched as my mother unwrapped the box with a curious glance. "You didn't have to go so fancy," she said, but not in the way people say it out of politeness. It was more like suspicion, like she was trying to figure out what it meant. Celeste arrived last, fashionably late, in a champagne-colored coat, and heels that had no business walking on leaf-covered driveways. She brought her new boyfriend, some kind of startup strategist with a hollow laugh, and a watch I could tell was fake from across the room. She barely acknowledged me beyond a tight-lipped smile. I returned the favor. Dinner began like all family dinners do. Too many people, too little space, and an uncomfortable pressure to pretend everything was fine. The conversation circled around Celeste's entrepreneurial plans, her social media collaborations, and her growing network in the lifestyle branding space. Everyone nodded like she was laying out a tech company IPO. No one asked me what I was working on. Not once, but the moment came sooner than I expected. Somewhere between dessert and post-meal coffee, Celeste wandered into the study, my old childhood bedroom, now converted into a guest room. I had stepped away to take a brief call from my assistant, in London, who was coordinating a last-minute bidding extension for a rare Art Deco sapphire brooch. I had left my laptop open, notes minimized, account window still active. When I returned, Celeste was sitting at the desk. She looked up slowly. Too slowly, her expression unreadable. "Is this real?" she asked, pointing to the screen. Her voice carried just loud enough for the others to hear. Before I could close, she spun the laptop around, revealing the balance. Over $12 million in assets across multiple portfolios. My most recent contracts displayed below, one with a European museum, another with a private royal estate. The room fell into a stillness so sharp it felt like the air itself had withdrawn. My father cleared his throat. My mother's fork hit the plate. Someone dropped their wine glass. Celeste laughed, a brittle sound. "Wow. Hiding a little empire, huh?" I stood still, hands resting on the back of the chair, my face unreadable. Then I said calmly, "No one asked. My mother recovered first." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We're just surprised, sweetheart." You never mentioned you were doing this well. If we'd known, we wouldn't have worried so much about you. You weren't worried about me, I replied. You were worried about how I might inconvenience you. Celeste leaned forward, arms crossed. But you could have helped more. If you've had this kind of money all along. I mean, Mom and Dad struggled to help me finish school. And you just watched. Her voice cracked with something that tried to pass for pain but couldn't mask the entitlement underneath. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just looked at her. This girl who had always been celebrated for showing up, while I had built a life in silence. I've been sending money for years, I said. Every emergency you had, every tuition gap, every credit card bill, I paid it. I paid for the vacations, for the insurance, for your imported bed linens. I paid it all, and none of you ever asked where it came from. My mother's face went pale. My father stared at the table. Celeste blinked, stunned into temporary silence. Then she said, "Well, why keep it a secret? Why wouldn't you want to help family more openly? We could have built something together." "We?" I asked, nearly laughing. There's never been a we. There's you, needing, and me, giving. And the only time you looked in my direction was when I had something you wanted. The room shifted. What had started as shock turned into defensiveness. My father stood. No matter what success you've had, you're still part of this family, and family means sharing. I looked at him and said what I had rehearsed for years. Family means showing up, not only when it's convenient, not only when there's money involved. I'm not your safety net. I'm not your secret investment. I closed my laptop, gathered my coat, and paused at the door. You didn't see me when I had nothing, and now that I've built everything, you only see the zeros. So no, I won't share this, because it was never yours to claim. Then I walked out. The silence behind me wasn't shocked anymore. It was furious. The text messages started before I even reached the highway. First my mother, short and sharp. "We need to talk. You can't just walk away like that." Then Celeste. "You humiliated us. I deserve to know. I'm your sister." And finally, my father. "Whatever this is, it isn't how family behaves. This is beneath you." I didn't reply to any of them. By the time I returned to Philadelphia, the story had begun spreading through the extended family. Filtered, distorted, dramatized. I received a Facebook message from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. "Heard you're doing well. Your cousin could use some guidance starting her Etsy store. Maybe you two could collaborate." Collaborate. What they meant was contribute, fund, be useful again, now that I was visible. Not one message asked how I was feeling. Not one asked whether I was okay after being ambushed in the middle of dinner. They just saw opportunity. A week later, Celeste posted a cryptic slideshow on Instagram. Filtered childhood photos of us together. Soft lighting, captions in cursive. The final frame read, "Not everyone with money has a heart." I didn't respond, but I saw the comments. Half of them were strangers offering sympathy. The other half, people who knew better, said nothing at all. I called Marcus the next morning. He was my attorney, the one I'd quietly retained the year before when I started getting suspicious about how freely my bank information had been passed around. I sent him screenshots, account records, message threads. "I want it clean," I said. "Financially, legally, all of it." He didn't flinch. "I'll start drafting the cease and desist letters today." That evening, I sat in my studio, the lights low, the windows fogged. I looked at my ledger, at the years of transfers labeled support, education, emergency. I'd sent over $160,000 to my family in 4 years. Quietly. Without thanks. Without conditions. I opened the last draft of the letter Marcus would send. I asked him to add one line, not in legal language, just plain English. "Love, if it exists, should never come with an invoice." Then I turned off my phone. And for the first Time in my adult life, I let the silence sit beside me without asking it to leave. Cutting ties wasn't a single moment. It was a slow, steady undoing, like taking off a jacket that had kept you warm for years, only to realize it had also been suffocating you. After the cease and desist letters were sent, the noise quieted. Not out of respect, out of stunned retreat. The messages stopped. The veiled guilt trips evaporated. Celeste's passive-aggressive posts lost their rhythm, replaced by curated silence. I imagine they were regrouping, trying to figure out how to spin the story now that their version of me, the background daughter, the soft-spoken supporter, no longer existed. Meanwhile, I moved forward. I signed a lease on a new space. A converted brick storefront with high ceilings and amber light. The kind of place that doesn't ask for attention but commands it with quiet dignity. I hired 2 new appraisers. One had a background in forensic gemology. The other had once worked restoring medieval religious artifacts. We weren't just a business now. We were a standard. I moved into a house just outside New Hope, Pennsylvania. It wasn't flashy, just clean lines, sunlit walls, and a garden overgrown with wild herbs. I spent long mornings there, drinking black tea and tracing the outline of a stone pendant that had once belonged to a widow in Marseille who'd asked me to find its story. I had found it, its markings traced back to a resistance courier during the war. That's the kind of work I did now. Work that mattered. One day, while clearing out an old drawer, I found the ledger. My original one. The place where I recorded my first $100 from my earliest freelance client. The handwriting was crooked, the ink slightly faded, but the pride was still sharp. I flipped through the pages, every transfer to my parents, every discount I gave, every time I chose generosity over recognition. I didn't feel regret. I felt relief. Relief that I had survived those years without letting them hollow me out completely. I no longer visited on holidays. I no longer waited for apologies or explanations. I no longer needed them to understand what they had lost, because I had finally accepted that some people will never love you in a way that nourishes you. They only love you in the way that uses you. Ramona came to visit one weekend. She walked through the new office, ran her fingers across the edge of a glass display case, and smiled. "You built something no one can take," she said. "And you did it without demanding applause." That night, I placed an antique brooch, one of my first real finds, on a velvet shelf in my personal archive. Not because it was rare, but because it reminded me of who I had been when I found it. Uncertain, invisible, but already paying attention. Didn't need validation anymore. I didn't need forgiveness. I needed space. I needed truth. And most of all, I needed to stop apologizing for how brightly I had learned to shine. And now, I had all of it. Naomi's story isn't just about money or even betrayal. It's about what happens when a person refuses to stay in the role they were quietly assigned. For years, she was the dependable one, the invisible support beam holding up everyone else's version of success. And when she finally stepped into her own light, the very people who ignored her demanded a share of the warmth. This is what emotional labor often looks like: unseen, unthanked, and expected. Naomi didn't just build a business. She built a boundary. And in doing so, she challenged the unspoken rule that strong means endlessly giving, endlessly forgiving. Her silence wasn't cold. It was disciplined. Her distance wasn't cruelty. It was protection. In a world that often glorifies self-sacrifice, Naomi chose self-respect. And that, more than any fortune, is the kind of legacy that cannot be stolen. What do you think? Was Naomi right to walk away from her family, or should she have given them another chance? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe for more powerful stories. Like this, and don't forget to turn on notifications. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the heaviest truths.